The station smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. It always had. Admiral Sarah Voss had spent 31 years breathing it, and she had long stopped noticing. What she noticed now was the document on her screen. 3 pages. Standard format. The consortium's golden sunburst emblem at the top, printed in ink that cost more than a Terran engineer made in a month. She read it twice. Then she signed it. The protest was filed at 0600 station time. The same as the last one. The same as the 14 before that. The consortium would receive it, stamp it, drop it into a database somewhere in the bureaucratic belly of their capital station, and forget it existed. This was diplomacy as the galaxy understood it. A performance everyone attended, and no one believed in. Voss set the stylus down. Outside the viewport, Earth turned. Blue and white, slow and indifferent, the way it had always turned. She had grown up watching it from this station. Her son had watched it too. For the 8 years she had kept him up here before the Kepler posting, before the reassignment, before. She looked away from the viewport. Her aide, Lieutenant Ren Mako, stood at the door, young, sharp, the kind of face that had not yet learned how to hide what it was thinking. He was thinking she looked tired. She was tired. They have confirmed the patrol route? She said. Yes, Admiral. 3 Vilhari dreadnoughts. They crossed the pale boundary at 0430. No intent filing with Terran Authority. No communication at all. Of course not. She stood. Her knees did not hurt the way they used to. The station's medical bay had done something about that last year. Something she had not asked questions about because she had not wanted to hear the answers. She was 54. The station was 54. They were the same age. She and this piece of floating metal. And some days she thought they were equally tired of holding themselves together. Where are they headed? Projected course puts them over the Mira colony by 1400. Mira. 50,000 people. Farmers mostly. Biodome agriculture. Supplying food to 3 other colony systems. The colony had been there for 60 years. Built by people who had scraped together what the consortium would allow them to have. No FTL drives. No exotic energy systems. Nothing that might make a human colony feel too permanent, too real, too much like a civilization, and not enough like a holding pattern. Vilhari dreadnoughts passing over Mira at low orbit was not an accident. Nothing the consortium did was an accident. It was a message, the same message it always sent. We are here. We are large. Sign the treaty. The treaty in question was a resource extraction agreement. Consortium mining corporations wanted access to 3 asteroid belts in the outer Terran system. The UN Terran Authority had been stalling for 8 months, raising objections, requesting amendments, playing the game as well as any species 300 years behind the galactic curve could manage. The dreadnoughts were the consortium clearing its throat. Voss walked to the tactical display and looked at the patrol route. 3 red markers moved in slow formation across the projected map. Vast. Unhurried, the way things moved when they did not believe anything could touch them. She studied the route for a long moment. Get me Ganymede Station on the secure channel, she said. Mako's face did the careful thing it did when he was choosing his words. Which channel, Admiral? You know which one. He left without another word. He was learning. It had taken him 2 years to stop looking surprised when she said things like that. But he had gotten there. Voss looked at the patrol route again. The Vilhari had catalogued everything they could see. That was their way, thorough, careful, centuries of intelligence work done on the quarantined human species. They knew the Terran Defense Fleet, ship counts, armament assessments, energy signatures, propulsion ratings. They had filed it all, and rated humanity's military capacity as negligible at their hull thickness, chemical propellants, fission reactors. Nothing exotic, nothing worth fearing. They were not wrong about what they had seen. They just had not seen everything. The secure channel opened, static first, then the clean audio of a properly shielded line. The voice that came through belonged to Director Hollis Crane, 70 years old, sounded like gravel, in a tin can, had never in his life delivered news in an excited tone. He delivered all news flat and precise, the way a man reads a parts list. Admiral, Director. Status. 87 arrays at full charge, 41 operational, 46 on reserve cycle. Ganymede primary lance is at 98.4%. The colony arrays are all green. We have been green for 11 days. 11 days. She had not slept well in 11 days. And the Mira Ridge installation came online 6 weeks ahead of schedule. A pause. Something that might have been pride. From a different kind of man. Your daughter-in-law's engineering team. Voss said nothing for a moment. Her daughter-in-law, Lena, who had kept the name Voss after everything, who had raised the grandchildren. Voss saw twice a year on video calls, because the posting allowed nothing more, who had poured her grief into blueprints and tunnel surveys and decades of quiet, patient work in sealed underground facilities that appeared on no consortium map. Lena had never once said the word Kepler to her. She did not need to. It was in every rivet. Tell me the lances are ready, Voss said. Not a question. It had not been a question for 3 years, not since the last simulation, not since the numbers had come back clean. She said it because it was the ritual of it, the way soldiers check weapons not because they doubt them but because the checking is itself a kind of faith. They are ready, Admiral. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Thank you, Director. She closed the channel. Outside, the Velhari dreadnoughts continued their slow arc toward Mira Colony. Voss watched the red markers crawl across the display, the galaxy's most powerful military machines, moving like they owned the space they moved through, because for 211 years, they had. She thought about the pale, the boundary line the consortium had drawn, politely, with all the careful diplomatic language of a civilization that considered itself kind. A protected developing species. That was what the charter said. Humanity had been classified, catalogued, and placed behind a line for its own good, the way you put a fence around something fragile or dangerous. They had never been quite sure which one they thought humans were. Voss had read the consortium's original quarantine documentation, declassified 30 years ago, and the uncertainty was right there in the language. Unpredictable, behavioral, patterns. Accelerated technological development relative to psychological maturity. Recommend containment, pending further study. Containment. Pending further study. 60,000 people had died at Kepler Colony because the consortium had decided a blockade was the cleanest way to enforce a trade restriction. No weapons fired, just ships in the way, stopping food convoys, stopping medicine transports, stopping the supply runs that kept a colony alive. 6 months. A lesson. The Velhari High Arbiter had called it, in the official report afterward, a necessary demonstration of the limits of unilateral human action. 60,000 people. A lesson. Voss picked up the signed protest document. 3 pages. Standard format. The right words arranged, in the right, useless, order. She set it back down. Her grandfather had been an engineer. Before him, the family line went back through ordinary work, ordinary hands, ordinary lives. None of them had been soldiers, but her grandfather had been the first to write down the thought experiment on the back of a supply invoice in a machine shop that smelled like oil and metal, just because he ran out of proper paper and the idea would not wait. Just physics. Just a question. What happened if you accelerated a dense object to a fraction of light speed using electromagnetic force? No exotic fuel. No consortium technology. Just current and rails and the fundamental laws of the universe, which belonged to everyone and could not be quarantined. The math was simple. It had always been simple. That was the thing no one outside the pale seemed to understand about humans. They had not invented the physics. The physics was always there, available to any species patient enough to work through it. Humans had been angry enough to do it in a cage. Mako reappeared at the door. The Velhari Patrol has made contact with Mira Colony's traffic control. They have declared a standard navigation survey approach. Navigation survey. Voss almost smiled. Of course. Is there anything I should prepare for, Admiral? Mako asked. He was being careful with the words. She could see him working out how to ask the real question without asking the real question. She looked at him for a moment. 23 years old. His mother was a hydroponics farmer on the Vega station. His father taught secondary school mathematics on the same station. He had joined the fleet because he believed in it. In what it stood for. She had believed in it once too. She still did, just differently. Yes, she said. Prepare a formal protest document. Unauthorized boundary crossing. Failure to file route intent. Make it thorough and correct. A pause. And after that? Open a channel to Mira Colony's Ridge Operations Center. He understood. She could see him understand. He was young, but he was not slow. Yes, Admiral, he said, and left. Voss turned back to the viewport. Earth turned below her, the same as always. Blue and patient. She had read once that human beings had stared at the stars for 100,000 years before they reached them, standing in fields and on rooftops and on the sides of dark mountains, looking at points of light and understanding without words that the universe was enormous and they were small. They had never once decided that was a reason to stop. The consortium had read that history and seen a warning. Voss had always read it as a promise. The secure channel to Mira Colony's Ridge Operations Center opened a minute later. The voice that answered was Lena's, steady and low, carrying something underneath it that Voss recognized not because she had the same thing, but because she had been the one who gave it to her. Grief, converted, shaped into something that could hold a purpose. "Sarah," Lena said. "Lena." A pause that held more than a pause had any right to hold. "How are the arrays?" "Aligned and green. We have been running final diagnostics since 0500. "And your team?" "A beat. Ready." Voss looked at the dreadnoughts on her display. At Mira Colony below them on the map, 50,000 people living their lives, growing food, teaching children, watching the same sky humans had always watched. "Good," she said. She did not say anything else. Neither did Lena. They did not need to. Two women connected by a loss that had no bottom, standing at the edge of something 200 years in the making, and all the words that mattered now were technical ones, angles and velocities and electromagnetic tolerances. Everything else had already been understood at Kepler, or rather, it had never needed to be said out loud. It had been carried, passed between people who kept it sharp deliberately, because something that's sharp made you careful, and careful made you accurate. "Stand by," Voss said. "Standing by," Lena answered. The dreadnoughts reached Mira Colony's outer orbit and settled into position, vast and certain. Certain in the way that only things which have never been challenged can be certain. Voss thought about her grandfather, pencil behind his ear, a supply invoice on the workbench, covered in numbers on the back, just a thought experiment, just physics, just an angry man in a small room asking what the universe would allow if you were patient enough to ask it properly. She reached for the communications panel. The protest document sat on her desk, signed and ready. She would send it, not because it would do anything, because it was how you kept records. How afterward, when the consortium reviewed the full sequence of events in order, the record would show that Terran Authority had done everything correctly, had followed every protocol, had filed every objection in good faith, in the right format, on time. And then the record would show what came next. Outside the viewport, Earth turned. Below it, Mira Colony breathed. On the equatorial ridge, pointed at the sky, 87 years of careful, patient, furious engineering waited for a word. High Arbiter Thessa von Kale was 340 years old, and he had seen bored. He was bored now. The observation deck of the Velhari Dreadnought Times Sovereign Reach Times was a wide, curved room designed to make whoever stood in it feel the appropriate size small, aware of the ship around them, aware of the ship's power and the empire that had built it. Kale had stood in rooms like this for 2 centuries. He no longer felt small in them. He felt what he always felt in them. Bored. Below the viewport, the human colony of Mira spread across the surface of the planet, like a stain that had learned to organize itself. Clusters of low buildings, long flat roads, connecting them. The green of the biodomes visible even from this altitude, bright against the brown and gray of the surrounding land. 500 kilometers of farms and houses and small lives, all of it contained neatly within the pale, all of it exactly as the consortium had intended it to be. Manageable. The word was not unkind. In Kale's mind, manageable was a condition of safety for everyone involved. Humans were, and this was in the official documentation. This was not a personal bias difficult. Their behavioral patterns were erratic. Their rate of technological development, when left unsupervised, outpaced their social and political maturity. The quarantine had been a reasonable solution to a real problem. It had been in place for 211 years. It had worked. Humans were still here, still developing, still alive, which was more than some species in their position had managed. He had made this argument many times. He believed it. He believed it the way an old man believes in a decision made when he was young, not because he had examined it recently, but because he had lived with it long enough that questioning it would mean questioning everything that came after, and there was too much that came after to make that practical. His intelligence officer, a young Velhari named Serov, stood to his right with a data tablet and the expression of someone who was about to say something that could have been put in a report instead. High Arbiter, the standard threat assessment, as you requested. Kale had not requested it. It was standing procedure. But Serov was new to his staff, and still thought procedure required active requesting. Go ahead. Terran Defense Fleet. 43 vessels, classified as light military. Primary armament is chemical propellant, kinetic weaponry, and fission-based energy emitters. Hull penetration risk to Velhari Dreadnought class negligible. Maximum effective range against our configuration also negligible. Serov paused. FTL. Capability. 0. They have no functional FTL drives and no licensed access to drive technology. Because we have not licensed it to them. Correct. And their energy weapon systems? Fission-based as stated. The yield profiles are consistent with what we documented 17 years ago during the last formal survey. No meaningful advances. Kale looked down at the colony. A small vehicle moved along one of the flat roads. He watched it until it became too small to track. And the population? Serov checked his tablet. Mira Colony. Approximately 52,000 registered residents. Primary economic activity is agricultural food production and export to neighboring Terran colony systems. 52,000 people growing food for other people who were also growing food. It was a closed loop. In a way. The consortium's trade restrictions kept human commerce mostly internal. They bought from each other, sold to each other, built for each other. The Pale was generous enough to allow a functioning economy. It was just not generous enough to allow anything that might become a real power. That was the balance. Kale had spent 40 years helping maintain it, and he considered it one of the better things he had done in a long life. The treaty situation, he said. Serov straightened slightly. The UN Terran Authority has declined to advance negotiations on the asteroid extraction agreement for the 8th consecutive month. Their stated objections include environmental impact assessments, equitable revenue sharing, and a request for independent oversight of extraction operations. Their real objection? Serov hesitated. Unclear, High Arbiter. Kale knew what it was. The humans thought the deal was bad. They were right. It was bad. But it was also what was available to them, because the alternative was no deal, and no access to the markets and technology channels that came attached to consortium trading agreements, and the Terran Authority's economists understood the math well enough to know that eventually they would sign. The dreadnoughts were just helping them understand the math a little more clearly. Take us into low orbit, Kale said. Standard demonstration profile. The Times Sovereign Reach Times adjusted its course. The other two dreadnoughts, the Times Honored Doctrine Times and the Times Meridian of Law, followed in formation. They moved the way they always moved, with the gravity of things that had no reason to hurry because nothing was going to stop them anyway. Kale watched the planet grow larger in the viewport. Mira Colony's traffic control center had made contact at the standard point, offering the standard greeting in standard Velhari diplomatic form, which the humans had learned to speak reasonably well over the past century. The controller had been polite, professional, had asked about the nature of the visit, as required by the Pale's entry protocols. The navigation survey declaration had been filed correctly by Kale's communications officer. Technically, sufficient. Technically, a survey. The fact that 3 Velhari dreadnoughts were an unusual survey team for a colony the consortium had catalogued in exhaustive detail many times was not something the protocol required them to address. The humans had said nothing to that. They had received the declaration, stamped it, and gone quiet. That was the correct response. That was the only response available to them. Kale found himself thinking, not for the first time, that humans were adaptable. Whatever else you said about them, and a great deal was said, in consortium, academic circles, in political circles, in the intelligence community, they were adaptable. They had taken their quarantine and built something inside it. Small things, human-scale things, but real ones. Food systems and engineering programs in schools, cities on moons and stations in asteroid fields. And those little biodome farms that glowed green against brown ground, they had not collapsed. That was more than the models had predicted. 60 years in, he had written a paper about it, once, long ago, about the resilience of the species and what it might mean for long-term consortium policy regarding the Pale. The paper had been well received in academic circles and ignored in political ones. He had not been surprised. He had filed the paper in his memory the way he filed most things that were correct but inconvenient, with a kind of sad precision, knowing it would matter eventually, unsure when. Low orbit achieved, his navigation officer reported. We are at optimal demonstration altitude. Below them, Mira Colony was close enough now to see the individual shapes of buildings. The biodomes were enormous from here. Great curved structures catching light. The roads were lines, and the vehicles on them were dots. Cale watched it in silence for a moment. Somewhere in the colony's communication systems, the formal protest from Terran authority would be arriving shortly. It would be correctly worded, correctly filed, precisely useless. The consortium would receive it, acknowledge it, and archive it. Cale himself would sign the acknowledgement, because that was also procedure, and procedure was the shape that civilization wore when it wanted to appear reasonable. He was prepared to sign the acknowledgement. He was prepared to accept the protest. He was not prepared for what his tactical officer said next. High Arbiter. The voice was careful in a way that pulled Cale's attention from the viewport before the words were finished. There is a structural feature on the colony's equatorial ridge that is not in our survey records. Cale turned. The tactical display had already shifted to show a magnified image of the ridge line. He looked at it, a series of large cylindrical structures, evenly spaced along the ridge, each one perhaps 40 meters in diameter. They were connected by what appeared to be infrastructure conduits, support frames, access platforms. The whole arrangement ran for several kilometers along the high ground. Industrial facilities? He asked. Possibly. The tactical officer did not sound certain. The construction style is consistent with Terran industrial architecture. No energy signatures that match anything in our database. Quote, how long have they been there? The ridge development is not in the last formal survey. A pause. The last formal survey of Mira Colony was conducted 11 years ago. 11 years was not a long time, by Velhari standards, but it was enough time to build things, and things that were not cataloged were, by definition, unknown. Cale looked at the cylinders. They were long. They were aligned. They were, he tilted his head, slightly arranged in sequence, each one positioned to follow the next in a clear directional line. He was not a weapons engineer. He had never needed to be. His empire had not needed a weapons engineer to look at an alien colony and feel concern, because alien colonies did not require that kind of concern. His science attaché, a young woman named Dreva who had been on his staff for 3 months and who had the habit of reading everything whether she was asked to or not, spoke from the back of the room. High Arbiter. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. Yes. Those cylinders. They are aligned in series. Each one is positioned to feed into the next in sequence. A pause. They are pointing at a 40-degree elevation angle, bearing directly toward our current position. The observation deck went still. Not the mechanical stillness of a paused room, the specific, deliberate stillness of Velhari who were thinking about what they had just heard and choosing not to move until they had decided what to do with it. Cale did not move. He looked at the cylinders on the display. Long, sequential, pointed upward at an angle that, if extended into space, would intercept the space his dreadnoughts currently occupied. Navigation survey he had filed. Standard demonstration profile. What are they? He asked. I do not know, Dreva said. We have no matching profile in the human technology database. There is no energy signature, no chemical exhaust, no power bloom that our sensors register. She was looking at her data screen, and her voice had the flat tone of someone reading something they were still deciding whether to believe. Whatever they run on, our sensors do not recognize it. Things we do not recognize, Cale said. Yes. Yes. He stood very still. Velhari communicated displeasure by going still. They communicated fear the same way, which was either an efficient use of the same signal or a cultural decision made long ago that some emotions did not deserve to be distinguished from each other. Cale had always thought it was the second one. He looked at the cylinders. Then at the tactical display showing his 3 dreadnoughts sitting in low orbit. Then at the cylinders again. "Serov," he said. "Hi, Arbiter. The threat assessment you read me. How old is the underlying data?" Serov checked his tablet. His fingers moved carefully. "The most recent direct observation data is from 11 years ago. The assessment model was updated 4 years ago, with extrapolated projections based on—" "Extrapolated," Kale said. "Yes, High Arbiter. So we assessed what we expected them to have, based on what we saw 11 years ago." "That is correct." Kale was still. The cylinders on the display were still too, long and gray and silent against the ridge, not doing anything, not glowing, not humming, not showing a single emission that his sensors could identify or quantify or fit into a category of known threat. Unknown things could be nothing. Unknown things were often nothing. Serov's assessment was probably correct, and the cylinders were probably industrial infrastructure, and this was probably a standard demonstration visit of a kind he had conducted 17 times in 200 years of diplomatic work, and everything was probably fine. He had spent his career on times, probably. "Begin approach withdrawal," he said. His navigation officer turned, surprised. "High Arbiter, we have not yet completed the standard. I said begin withdrawal." The officer turned back to his controls. Kale kept his eyes on the cylinders. They did not move. They did not change. They sat along the ridge in the afternoon light of the colony's sun, gray and large and perfectly still. And they told him absolutely nothing about what they were. And that silence where data should have been was the first thing in a very long time that had made him feel something he did not immediately have a name for. Not fear. He was 340 years old, and he had not felt genuine fear since his 2nd century. Something quieter than fear. Something more careful. The feeling a man gets when he realizes, in the middle of a familiar room, that a piece of furniture has moved, and he cannot remember moving it, and no one else should have been in the room. The withdrawal had barely begun when his communications officer spoke. "High Arbiter. Incoming transmission from Terran Authority. Standard protest filing. Unauthorized boundary crossing. Failure to file route intent. S. Acknowledge it," he said. Standard response. "Yes, sir." And the officer paused. "There is a second transmission from the colony surface. It is addressed to us directly. Marked as coming from the Mira Colony Ridge Operations Center." Kale turned. "What does it say?" The officer read it aloud. Short, 3 sentences. The first sentence was a formal greeting in Velhari diplomatic language, correctly structured. The second sentence was a notification that Terran Authority had filed a protest regarding the boundary crossing, which Kale already knew. The third sentence was a request that the Velhari patrol please maintain its current altitude and heading for the next 4 minutes to allow for the safe completion of a routine technical calibration being conducted at the Ridge Operations Center. Kale read it twice in his head after the officer finished. Maintain current altitude and heading. Routine technical calibration. He looked at the cylinders on the display, pointing upward, 40-degree angle, bearing that intersected precisely with where his ships were. He did not finish the thought. "All ships," he said. "Maximum withdrawal speed." Now, the time Sovereign Reach times moved. Not quite fast enough. The tactical room on Voss's station had a smell to it that she had never been able to identify precisely. Not coffee. Not recycled air. Something else. Something that came from the equipment itself, from the displays and the processing units running at full capacity, from the heat of 40 people in a sealed room, who all understood what was about to happen and had decided not to talk about it. She had been in the room for 6 hours. Mako stood at the communications station. The 4 tactical officers stood at their displays. The targeting systems team, 4 people who had spent 11 years learning how to operate equipment that had officially never existed, sat in a row along the far wall, with their eyes on their screens and their hands in their play. Laps. Nobody sat the way people sit when they are relaxed. The Velhari patrol had gone into withdrawal 11 minutes ago. KL had ordered it. She did not know why, and she did not particularly care why. What she cared about was the geometry. The targeting solution on her display was a set of numbers and lines and projected arcs that her grandfather would have recognized instantly, and most of the galaxy had never considered. The 3 dreadnoughts were large, slow to maneuver, and built for the kind of warfare that happened between ships that could see each other coming. They were not built for the kind of warfare that arrived from a planetary surface, at 4% the speed of light, with no warning, and no energy signature, and no explanation. They were not built for it because no one had told them they needed to be. Director Crane's voice came through the secure channel. Ganymede Lance is holding at 100%. Colony arrays confirm green across all 87. Mira Ridge sequence is locked. We are waiting on your order, Admiral. Voss looked at the display. The Times-honored Doctrine Times was the dreadnought in the middle of the formation. The Times Sovereign reached Times Kale's ship. She had confirmed the registration was to the right. The third ship, the Times Meridian of Law, was to the left and slightly behind. She was not going to fire at the ships. She needed to be clear with herself about that, and she was. She had been clear about it for a year. The plan had never been to destroy the patrol. The plan was to demonstrate something, to show the consortium, in language they had never heard before and would not be able to argue with, that the calculation had changed. 1 shot, 3 rods. Kinetic energy measured in the kind of numbers that made engineers quiet. Not at the ships. In front of them, precisely in front of them, at calculated intercept vectors that would force each dreadnought to maneuver or take damage. Ships, maneuvering in a panic, told a story. Ships that had to move because of what was arriving in front of them. Ships that had never needed to panic in 200 years of Imperial patrol work. Those ships were a message that every other empire in the consortium would read and understand immediately. The math was the message. She had spent a long time making sure the math was right. Director, she said, fire solution is on your board. Confirm receipt. Confirmed. Solution received. 3 rods. Mira primary array. Lance sequence 7. Target vectors are. A pause. Target vectors are intercept, not direct. Confirming non-impact solution for all 3 vessels. Correct. Confirmed. Admiral, at the current withdrawal speed, the window opens in 40 seconds. The window is 22 seconds wide. 40 seconds. She had 40 seconds to decide whether 200 years of planning was worth the moment it became real. Whether this was the right time, the right place, the right provocation, whether 11 dead at Kepler in 2193 justified the weight of what she was about to start. Not 11. 60,000. Her brain had simplified the number. It did that sometimes. Protective compression. She corrected it deliberately, the way she always corrected it. 60,000. She held the number in her mind until it was the right size. Then she let it go. Authorize firing sequence, she said. Authorization, Voss Sierra 7. Authorization confirmed. Crane's voice had no triumph in it, no excitement, just the same flat precision. Lance, sequence armed. 28 seconds to window. Voss looked at the display. The 3 dreadnoughts were moving, accelerating on their withdrawal course. The Times, Sovereign Reach Times, was fastest. Kale's ship was better crewed. The Times-honored Doctrine Times and the Times Meridian of Law Times were following at slightly lower acceleration rates. The geometry was clean. The targeting solution adjusted in real time as they moved. 20 seconds, Crane said. One of the targeting technicians in the far row made a very small sound, somewhere between an exhale and something else, and then was quiet. 15. Mako's hands were flat on his station. He was not touching anything. He was just standing, with his hands flat and his eyes on his screen. 10. Voss thought about her grandfather's supply invoice. The one with the equations on the back. She had it in her quarters, framed, because it had seemed important to frame it even though she could barely read his handwriting. The equations were simple. She had looked them up. High school physics. The same equations taught to children on every consortium world, because the universe ran on the same physics everywhere and the physics did not care about political boundaries. 5, 4, 3, 2. She did not close her eyes. She watched the display. The lance fired. There was no sound. That was the first thing. Back in her grandfather's day, people had imagined railguns as loud. The movies had made them loud. Great booming cracks of electromagnetic discharge. The Ganymede lance at full fire was quiet. A deep electronic pulse that her instruments recorded and her body did not feel. And then the rods were gone, already moving too fast for any instrument on the platform to track directly. She could only see them as projected lines on the display. 3 thin green lines extending from the ridge coordinates toward the black of space, at a velocity that the display could only approximate. because approximation was all the available computing power could manage at that speed. The tactical display showed the rods as projections, moving lines. The dreadnoughts showed as red shapes. The lines were going to the space in front of the red shapes. The window was 22 seconds. The rods crossed the pale boundary at second 3. The dreadnought sensors would be reading them now or trying to. No energy signature, no chemical exhaust plume, no particle wake, just mass arriving at a velocity that consortium sensor doctrine had never anticipated needing to account for. Her intelligence analysts had spent 3 years studying Velhari sensor architecture. They had concluded that the dreadnoughts would detect the rods approximately 0.4 seconds before impact. 0.4 seconds. At that speed, that was 8 kilometers. You cannot maneuver a dreadnought 8 kilometers in 0.4 seconds. What you could do was watch. The first and third rods passed precisely through their intercept vectors, through empty space, exactly as calculated. The calculated spaces being forward of the times sovereign reach times, and forward of the times meridian of law, close enough that the kinetic disturbance of passing mass at that velocity would register on every sensor the ships had as a category of event, for which they had no category. The second rod was also correct. The calculation was correct. The targeting solution had been run 4,000 times. The Mira Ridge array had been calibrated by Lena's team, and Lena's team did not make errors because Lena's team had grown up with the same reason Voss had, the same reason that had been building in the walls of the human species for 2 centuries, and reasons that size made people very careful about their work. The second rod was correct. The Times-honored doctrine times was not. Kale's withdrawal order had been issued late, but it had been issued. The Times sovereign reach times and the Times meridian of law times had already committed to their vectors when Kale gave the command, and they had held those vectors. And those vectors were where the solution placed the intercepts. The Times-honored doctrine, Captain had panicked. That was the only word for it. Panicked. Had received Kale's order, and then received the 0.4-second sensor alarm, and done the calculation wrong. Burned thrust in the wrong direction, trying to get the ship away from something he could not see clearly, and did not understand. And moved the ship not out of the intercept vector, but slightly through it. The rod did not destroy the Times-honored doctrine. It was not supposed to. Even the direct impact, which was also not supposed to happen, did not destroy it. A tungsten composite rod the size of a transit bus traveling at 4.2% light speed, hitting a dreadnought glancing along the forward port quarter, it did not destroy the ship. It removed the forward port quarter, cleanly, precisely, in the way that physics removes things when it is applied with sufficient mathematics and sufficient speed. The forward port quarter of the Times-honored doctrine times weapon systems, sensor arrays, crew quarters for the forward sections. The ship's primary communications tower simply ceased to be part of the ship and became a debris field, traveling in a slightly different direction. Voss watched the dreadnought icon on her display change shape. Damage report is coming in on consortium emergency channels, Mako said. His voice was steady. She had trained it to be steady. The training held. The Times-honored doctrine times is registering as still mobile. Propulsion intact. Life support in the main hull is intact. Casualties? Mako looked at his screen. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The consortium emergency channel is reporting 11 crew. 11. Voss closed her eyes. 2 seconds. She opened them. 11 was not 60,000. She knew that. She had known it before the shot was authorized, and she had authorized it anyway. Because this was what the shape of the situation required, because the alternative was another generation of people living inside a line someone else drew, because the only language the consortium had ever actually heard was the language of consequence. She knew all of that. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds anyway, because 11 was also 11. 11 was people who had woken up that morning and done what they were told and gone where they were ordered to go and stood in the part of the ship that was later not there. 11 was a number you had to hold at the right size before you could do anything useful with it. She held it, then she set it down, carefully. In the same place she kept 60,000, in the part of her that did not forgive and did not forget and did not allow either of those things to become something weak. Send the treaty counterproposal, she said, the version we discussed in March. Full text, all amendments, a pause, and a formal expression of regret regarding the navigational incident. To the Times-honored doctrine, Times specifically, Copied to Velhari, Imperial Command. Mako was quiet for a moment. A formal expression of regret. Yes, for the navigational incident. That is what I said. Another moment, then, yes, Admiral. She meant the regret. That was the thing that people who did not know her would not understand. She meant it, completely. She regretted that the Times-honored doctrine's captain had panicked and moved his ship into a non-impact vector. She regretted the 11 dead. She regretted every single one of them, individually, in the honest way that people regret things they cannot undo and did not intend and chose to risk anyway. She also meant the counter-proposal. The treaty was real. The terms in it were fair, genuinely fair, with equitable revenue sharing and independent oversight mechanisms, and a renegotiation clause every 5 years. She had not drafted it as a mockery. She had drafted it because when this was over and the consortium had understood what the geometry had changed to, there needed to be something real to move toward. Regret and determination were not opposites. She had learned that at 54 the way most humans learned it, by carrying both of them in the same chest for a long time, until they stopped feeling like they contradicted each other. Director Crane, she said, Admiral, stand all arrays down to maintenance status. Keep Ganymede on 30-minute ready. Understood. And tell your team. She stopped. She did not usually do this. She was not sure what made her do it now, whether it was exhaustion or something closer to the surface than she had accounted for. Tell your team that they did their work correctly. Every part of it. A pause. Long, by Crane standards. I will tell them, Admiral. The display showed the Velhari patrol withdrawing at maximum speed. The Times-honored doctrine times slower than the others, dragging the open wound of its forward section through the space above the pale. The debris field was already spreading on its own trajectory, silent, following the physics, which did not make exceptions for intent or regret. Mako spoke quietly. The consortium emergency channels are going loud, Admiral. Multiple broadcasts, multiple ships. They are transmitting the damage report on several frequencies simultaneously. To whom? Everyone, he said. Every consortium member state. Every empire in the compact. All of them. Voss nodded. That was correct. That was the transmission she had expected. That was, in a way, the most important part, not the shot, not the damage, but the way the consortium would spread the information themselves, instantly, across every communication channel they had, because the damage to the Times, honored doctrine Times, was the kind of thing that every empire needed to know about immediately, and evaluate and run their own numbers on, and when they ran their own numbers they would arrive at the same place Kale was about to arrive. The math, not the weapon, the math that the weapon performed, the implication sitting inside the physics. In a few hours, every intelligence service in the consortium would be doing what Seraph had failed to do, looking at human construction over not 11 years but 2 centuries, looking at the geological surveys of asteroid interiors and the power consumption records of colony stations and the manufacturing reports of facilities they had classified as industrial, and assembling from those pieces a picture that had been hiding in plain sight behind the assumption that a quarantined species was a contained species. The math would be clear. Humans had been building this for 200 years, in the dark, in a cage, patiently, precisely, without showing it, generation after generation passing the plans down, and the reasons down, and the grief down, until they had something that could speak in a language the consortium could not argue with. Voss looked at the stars on the display. The dreadnoughts were specks now, retreating. The pale boundary line ran across the tactical display where it always ran the line that marked the edge of what humans were officially permitted. She had not crossed it. She had fired from inside it. That was the other thing the intelligence services would understand when they did their full analysis. Terran authority had not violated the pale. Not technically. Every lance was inside the boundary. Every piece of equipment was inside the permitted Terran territory. Humans had built a weapons network inside the cage, and the network could reach out of the cage while remaining entirely within it. The cage was still there. The math had changed what the cage meant. She thought about the protest document she had sent this morning. Correctly worded, correctly filed. She thought about how it would sit in the consortium's database alongside this day's events, and what the combination of those two things would look like to an historian reading it 50 years from now. Probably the same thing it was designed to look like. A species that had done everything right and been ignored anyway, and then had stopped asking. "Admiral," Mako said, "we are receiving a transmission from the Times Sovereign Reach. From High Arbiter Kale personally." Voss looked up. "What does it say?" Mako read it. 3 sentences. The first was a formal acknowledgement of the protest filing. The second was a statement that Velhari Imperial Command would review the events of the day and respond through appropriate diplomatic channels. The third sentence was addressed to Voss directly, which was irregular. Kale should have addressed it to Terran authority. He had addressed it to her by name. It said, "We will speak soon." Not a threat, not a promise. Something in between, in the flat, formal language of a man who had just done math he was not finished doing. Voss read it twice. Then she set it aside and looked out the viewport at the planet below, and the stars beyond it, and the line across her display that someone else had drawn, to tell her where she was allowed to be. "Tell him," she said, "that we look forward to it." The emergency broadcast went out on 17 frequencies simultaneously. Kale sent it himself, from his personal command chair on the Times Sovereign Reach, while the ship was still accelerating away from the Pale at a speed that felt, for the first time in his career, like it was not quite enough. The Times-honored Doctrine Times was behind them, bleeding atmosphere from the open wound, where its forward quarter used to be. 18 ships from the nearest consortium patrol fleet were already moving to assist. The crew of the Times, honored Doctrine Times, was not in danger of dying. Kale had made sure of that first. Then he had sent the broadcast. He sent it personally because that was how every intelligence director and military commander and sitting emperor in the consortium compact would know immediately, before they had read a single word of the report, that something had changed. Kale did not send things personally. He was the High Arbiter. He had a staff of 300 people, whose entire purpose was to send things on his behalf. The act of doing it himself was a signal before the signal. By the time the Times Sovereign Reach Times had cleared the outer boundary of the Mira system, he had 47 responses in his queue. He did not read them. He called Dreva into his study instead. She came without being told to bring her data tablet, because she had been carrying it since the observation deck and had not set it down. She stood in the doorway of his small study the way young staff stood when they were not sure if they were allowed to sit. Which was to say, she stood slightly too straight and looked directly at the wall behind his head. "Sit," he said. She sat. "What did we actually see?" He said. She had the answer ready. She had clearly been organizing it since the observation deck, and was waiting for someone to ask for it in those exact words, because those were the right words. 3 kinetic impactors. Solid tungsten composite, based on the debris spectroscopy we managed to capture from the Times-honored Doctrine. Secondary sensors before the forward array was destroyed. Mass is estimated at approximately 17,000 kilograms per unit. She looked at her tablet. Velocity at intercept. 4.2% of light speed. Kale looked at her. "Perunit." "Yes, High Arbiter." He did the math in his head. He was not a physicist, but he was 340 years old, and somewhere in that time he had learned enough physics to know what mass and velocity produced. The number that came out of his calculation was a number he had to run again, because numbers that large were usually the result of a computational error, and not of a reality you needed to sit with. He ran it again. The number was the same. Each of those 3 rods had hit the space in front of his ships, carrying the kinetic energy of a tactical nuclear device. No exotic fuel, no energy signature his ships could detect in time to do anything about it. No technology licensed by the consortium, because the consortium had never licensed it, because the consortium had looked at human engineering capability and made certain assumptions about what humans could develop inside the Pale, and those assumptions were now debris, expanding through the Mira system, in a direction that physics had chosen and no one had approved. "Where were they fired from?" he said. "The Mira colony equatorial ridge. The cylindrical structures we observed." Dreva was quiet for a moment. "I have been running the power consumption data for Mira colony over the past decade. We have energy use records from the colonial utility systems the consortium required full disclosure as part of the original Pale agreement." She looked up. The ridge installation consumed power consistent with industrial operations, mining, smelting, or heavy manufacturing. Nothing in that consumption profile would have indicated weapon systems to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. Was anyone specifically looking for it? She did not answer immediately. Which was an answer. He leaned back. How long has that installation been operational? The Mira Ridge installation, based on construction records and geological survey data that our survey team filed 11 years ago and did not flag as significant, appears to have been started 41 years. She paused. But the Mira installation is not the only one. Kale went still. Explain that. Dreva turned her tablet to face him. On the screen was a map. Terran space inside the Pale. 17 colony systems. And across those 17 systems, marked in the data she had been assembling since the observation deck, a series of points that each corresponded to geological anomalies, power consumption patterns, industrial declarations, and facility types that, looked at individually, meant nothing, and looked at together formed a pattern that was very clear and very large, and had been in the consortium's own filed survey data for decades. 41 years is the youngest installation, she said. The Ganymede facility, which our models indicate as the primary system, based on power consumption, shows tunneling activity that began 207 years ago. He looked at the map. He looked at the date. 207 years ago was 11 years after the quarantine was established. He did not say anything. He was very still. In total, Dreva said, based on cross-referencing all available consortium survey data, with energy consumption records and construction filings, I estimate there are between 80 and 90 functional installations distributed across 14 Terran colony systems, all inside the Pale, all built using technologies that appear, individually, to be standard Terran industrial equipment. All firing solutions, if they follow the same principle as Mira, would be capable of reaching any point in Terran space, and a substantial volume of adjacent space beyond the Pale boundary. Kale looked at the map for a long time. The Pale was a line on it. A boundary. The thing the consortium had drawn to keep the quarantine orderly, to give everyone a clear visual of where human space ended. On one side of the line, everything else. On the other side, the 87 installations Dreva had found in the consortium's own filed survey records, which no one had looked at as a pattern, because no one had thought there was a pattern worth looking for. Why did no one see this? He said. Because we were not looking for it, Dreva said. We assessed humans against what we expected them to develop. We looked for exotic energy systems, for FTL research, for armament types consistent with consortium military architecture. She paused. We did not look for kinetic mass drivers because kinetic mass drivers are considered a primitive technology in consortium weapons doctrine. We moved past that phase 600 years ago, and humans have not moved past it. No, they developed it. She was quiet. They developed it to a degree that appears to exceed anything we achieved during our own kinetic weapons phase, because we moved on after 3 centuries, and they have been working on it for 2. Another pause. There was nothing else for them to work on. All the other paths were restricted. The cage, Kale thought. He had built the cage to limit what they could become. He had built it out of everything except the physics they already had, because the physics was there in the universe and could not be taken away, or licensed, or restricted. And somehow, in 200 years of detailed intelligence work on the quarantined human species, no one had thought carefully enough about what happened. When a species with documented persistence and documented adaptability was left alone, in a box, with access to fundamental physics, and a reason to be angry, he stood from his chair and walked to the narrow viewport in his study wall. The stars were there, the way they always were, ancient and indifferent. The Pale was behind them now, invisible from here, just a line on charts. A line that tonight meant something different than it had this morning. He thought about Kepler. He did not think about it often. He had made the blockade order in what he genuinely believed was a measured and appropriate response to a series of Terran unilateral trade actions. He had approved a 6-month supply restriction on a single colony system, expecting compliance within the first 3 months. When compliance had not come in 3 months, he had reviewed the situation and decided to continue. When compliance had not come in 6 months, and the mortality figures had been filed in his office, he had ended the blockade immediately and filed a diplomatic notation that referred to the event as a navigational and supply disruption of unusual duration. 60,000 people. He had known the number. He had read it in the report. He had weighed it against the strategic necessity of demonstrating that Terran unilateral action had consequences, and he had concluded, on the weight of the balance, that the lesson was necessary. That was the word he had used. He stood at the viewport, and the stars went on in every direction. And somewhere behind him, Dreva was sitting with her tablet, and her map, and her 207 years of careful, patient, human engineering, and Cale thought about the word times, lesson times, and what it had grown into in the dark of the cage he had built. His communication system chimed. The 47 responses in his queue had become 219. Every empire in the compact was responding now. He could hear the shape of the conversation without reading the specific words: alarm, skepticism, demands for more information, competing theories, the loud immediate noise of powerful people confronting something they had not prepared for and were now scrambling to categorize. He did not go to his communication system. He went to his filing archive instead. He searched for the formal human protest filed after the Kepler colony embargo. He had a copy. He kept copies of everything. 340 years of administrative habit. He found it, opened it, read it from the beginning. It was what he remembered: correct diplomatic language, correct format, appropriate citations of the Pale Compact provisions that the blockade had technically not violated but had certainly strained. He had read it many times. He had found it at the time to be well-written and completely irrelevant, because the outcome the Terran Authority wanted, a formal censure and a commitment to no future blockades, was not an outcome the consortium was going to provide, and the correctness of the protest language did not change that. He read through to the end. There was a paragraph near the end that he had read before and dismissed as rhetoric. He read it again now. It said, in the careful, neutral language of professional diplomats who knew their words would be filed and forgotten, that the Terran Authority formally requested that the consortium recognize the right of human colonies to develop and maintain defensive systems proportionate to demonstrated threats, that this right was inherent in the colony charter. That Terran Authority intended to exercise this right as a matter of policy going forward, and that any questions about the nature or extent of such systems should be directed through appropriate diplomatic channels. He had read it as a bluster, standard language, something they put in protest to have something to point to later. He looked at the date on the protest, 162 years ago. He looked at the map on Dreva's tablet, which she had left open on his desk. 162 years ago, humans had filed a formal notice, in the right language, through the right channels, correctly formatted, and then they had continued building, and the consortium had continued ignoring the filing, and here was the result, visible in the data of the consortium's own surveys, laid out in the pattern of 87 installations distributed across 14 colony systems that had been waiting, quietly, for 162 years, since before the people who built most of them were born, since before the people who designed them were born, since before everything except the reason had been born. Cale sat down at his desk. He had spent his career believing that the quarantine was mercy. That was not a lie he had told himself. He genuinely believed it, had argued for it in writing and in conference rooms for 2 centuries, had defended it against the consortium members who wanted harsher restrictions and against the minority voices who wanted loosening. He had been the moderate position, the humane one. He sat with that now. He sat with what 200 years of humane quarantine had produced, in the dark, where no one had looked carefully enough. Not because they were hiding it particularly well. They had filed the paperwork. They had declared the facilities as industrial. They had put the protest in the record. Every piece of it was in the consortium's own filed data, visible to anyone who read it as a whole, instead of in separate assessments by separate departments. That each had their own category for human development, and none of those categories connected to each other. The consortium had not been outsmarted. It had not been deceived by superior human cunning. It had done what large, powerful, comfortable empires do when they look at smaller, contained things. It had assumed the smaller thing was doing what the smaller thing had always done, and it had not looked too hard, because looking too hard implied the possibility of finding something, and finding something would require a response. And the comfortable position was that no response was required. He opened his communications queue. 253 responses now. He read 3 of them. The first was from the Marithian Imperial Council, asking for a full tactical briefing. The second was from the Praxis Governance Board, requesting emergency session. The third was from the Consortium Secretary of Military Affairs, asking a question in language that was trying very hard to be calm. The question was, "How many installations are there?" Kale thought about the map on Dreva's tablet. 87 confirmed. Distributed across 14 systems, each one capable of firing projectiles from inside the pale to targets outside the pale. Each one currently, as of the Mira incident, demonstrably operational. He thought about the number of human colonies inside the pale. He thought about how many of them he had surveyed in the past decade. He thought about how many of them he had surveyed carefully. He looked at Dreva. "Is this the complete list?" She met his eyes. Steady. "This is the list I assembled from existing consortium survey data. High Arbiter. I cannot determine how many installations exist that were not within the coverage of our surveys." He nodded. He picked up the response to the Secretary of Military Affairs. He wrote, "Briefing to follow. Convene the compact assembly. I am returning to the capital." He did not answer the specific question about how many installations there were, not because he was hiding something, because the honest answer was that he did not know, and the honest answer to that was that they had never looked. And the honest answer to that was worse than any specific number. He sent the response. Outside the viewport, the stars continued in every direction. Behind the ship, the pale was a line on charts that tonight meant something different than it had this morning. The cage was still there, intact. The line was still drawn where it had always been drawn. The math had changed what the cage meant. He thought about what he was going to say in the assembly. He had given speeches in that assembly for 120 years. He had always known what he was going to say before he said it, because he had always understood the situation well enough to describe it before he arrived. This time he did not know what he was going to say. He knew what he was going to have to stop saying. A lesson, he had called Kepler. A necessary demonstration. He had believed it then, and he had continued believing it through 200 years of morning briefings and diplomatic sessions, and that patient, human protest, filed in the correct language, through the correct channels, and promptly archived and forgotten. He sat very still at his desk. He looked at the map. The humans had built this in the dark, with what they had and what they knew. For the same reason people build anything in the dark with what they have. Because the dark was where they were put, and what they had was all they were given. And the reason was right there, in the shape of everything that had happened, to them, readable by anyone who took the time to look. He had not taken the time to look. He had assumed there was nothing to see. He sat with that for a long time. Then he pulled up the formal human treaty counterproposal that Terran Authority had transmitted shortly after the incident. He read it. All of it. The equitable revenue provisions and the oversight clauses and the renegotiation terms. It was a fair document. Genuinely fair. He read it twice to be sure he was not misreading it. He was not. He sat with that too. Then he told his communications officer to set a course for the capital at maximum speed and clear his schedule for the next 3 weeks. There was an assembly to prepare for, and before the assembly, there was a message he needed to compose, not to the Secretary of Military Affairs, not to the Imperial Council, to Terran Authority, to Voss, by name, because she had done him the professional courtesy of demonstrating exactly what she had, and why she had it, and what she was prepared to do with it. And that kind of honesty deserved a response in kind. He had no idea yet what the response was going to say. He began writing it anyway. 6 months after the shot, it rained in Geneva. Not symbolic rain. Real rain. The gray, persistent kind that the city got in autumn, that made the streets dark and the lake flat and the old buildings look like they had always been there and would always be there, which was the impression Geneva had been designed to give because it was a city built by people who understood that permanence was a feeling you could engineer if you arranged the right stones in the right order. Admiral Sarah Voss stood at the window of the UN Assembly Building's preparation room and looked at the rain. She had a cup of coffee that she had not drunk. Behind her, 4 members of the Terran Authority negotiating team were going over the briefing materials for the 3rd time in 2 hours, not because the briefing materials had changed, but because going over them again was what you did when you were waiting for something historic, and you needed your hands to be doing something. Mako stood by the door. He had not said anything in 40 minutes. He had learned, in the past 6 months, when to say nothing. It was one of the more valuable things she had watched him learn. 6 months. In 6 months, The consortium had convened an emergency assembly, conducted a full review of Terran intelligence procedures, commissioned 17 separate reports on human technological development, issued a formal statement acknowledging that the Mira incident involved a navigational error by the Times honored doctrine's captain rather than an intentional attack, and quietly stopped every active expansion plan within 3 light years of the pale boundary. The mining corporations with extraction agreements pending had received no explanation. They had not required one. They were corporations, and corporations understood the language of risk assessments being quietly revised. Every empire in the consortium compact had run their own version of Dreva's analysis. Kale had not shared Dreva's analysis. He had not needed to. Every intelligence service in the compact had people who could read geological surveys and power consumption data and construction filings and see the same pattern that Dreva had seen once they knew to look for it. Once they knew to look for it, they had looked very hard and very fast. The number they arrived at was not 87. 87 was the confirmed number from consortium survey data. The number they arrived at, accounting for survey gaps and unvisited systems and facilities, built in the years since the last formal survey, and the very large question of what was in the asteroid belts and moons that the consortium had never surveyed because they had not thought there was anything there worth surveying. That number was larger. How much larger? No one knew, including Voss. She had not told anyone that. She did not need to. The uncertainty was the point. The uncertainty was what had turned the conversation from whether to negotiate to when. The delegation had arrived last night, which was why Voss had been in Geneva for 2 days, and why she had drunk more bad coffee in 2 days than she usually drank in a month. 7 emperors, 14 staff members each, a security detail that her people had worked out an extremely careful arrangement with, because you could not have consortium imperial security armed in a room with Terran military personnel without everyone being very clear about the rules in advance. Kale was leading the delegation. She had known he would be. His messages over the past 6 months had been exactly what his first message had been: formal in language, direct in intent, carrying underneath the formal language a tone that she had read as a man who was doing a great deal of thinking and wanted her to know he was doing it. They were not warm messages. They were not friendly. They were the messages of someone who respected precision enough to use it honestly. She could work with that. The door opened. One of the authority's protocol officers leaned in. "They are ready, Admiral." She picked up her coffee, set it down, left it. The assembly hall had been built in the 20th century by people who believed that if you put enough nations in the same room with high ceilings and good acoustics, you could make them talk instead of fight. The theory had worked imperfectly, the way most theories about human beings worked imperfectly, but the room was still there, and it still had high ceilings. And today it held something the 20th century architects had not anticipated when they chose the sightlines and the seat placement. 7 galactic emperors, sitting in chairs clearly designed for human bodies, in various states of managed discomfort. Voss walked in. She walked the way she always walked, the same pace, the same posture, the same expression that her officers had long ago decided meant she had somewhere to be, and was simply passing through the current location on the way there. She sat at the Terran Authority table without looking at the Emperor's delegation longer than a moment, because looking too long was a kind of statement, and she was saving her statements. Kale sat at the center of the delegation table, 340 years old, and he showed about 120 of them, the Velhari, aged slowly, which was either an advantage or just a longer way to be old, depending on how good the century was. He was large for a Velhari, which made him large by most standards. He wore the formal gray of consortium diplomatic rank, which had no decoration on it, because the decoration was considered a form of bragging, and Velhari of his rank did not brag. He looked at her when she sat. She looked back. The protocol officer opened the session with the formal language that protocol officers had developed over centuries, specifically so that sessions could begin without anyone having to say the thing they actually came to say before they were ready. Welcome. Acknowledgement of parties. Statement of intent. Recording notice. End. It took 7 minutes. Then the Merithian Emperor, small, blue-gray, with the perpetually polite expression of a species that had evolved in cooperative family groups and could not look threatening even when they were trying opened, with the consortium's formal position statement. The statement was long. Voss had read the draft of it 3 days ago through channels she was not supposed to have, which meant she could listen to it now with the attention of someone who already knew where it was going. It said, "The Mira incident was regrettable. The consortium acknowledged certain failures in intelligence assessment. The consortium wished to express its commitment to a productive ongoing relationship with Terran Authority. The consortium wished to open discussions regarding the status of the Pale, and whether modifications to certain provisions of the Pale Compact were appropriate to consider. Modifications to certain provision." Voss had read that phrase in the draft and thought about the language the way she thought about all diplomatic language, which was to find the thing it was trying to say without saying it. The thing it was trying to say was, the Pale Compact, as written, assumed a certain relationship between the consortium's military capacity and Terran human capacity, and that relationship had changed, and the compact needed to change with it, but they were not going to say it that way, because saying it that way meant admitting something. The Merithian Emperor finished. Politely. Correctly. There was a pause for translation, even though the translation happened in real time through earpieces, and everyone at both tables had been listening to their own language the entire time. The pause was courtesy. The pause said, "We have finished speaking. We believe you understood us. We are giving you a moment to acknowledge that before you respond." Voss looked at the Merithian Emperor, then at the other 6, then at Kale. She said, "Thank you for your formal position statement. Terran Authority notes its receipt." A pause. "High Arbiter, you did not come to give us a position statement." The Merithian Emperor's polite expression did not change, which meant it had changed in a very small way. Kale looked at her. He did not look at the Merithian Emperor, who had just spoken for the delegation and was technically the primary speaker for this session. He looked at Voss, because she had addressed him, and because the Velhari responded to directness, with directness, even when the protocol suggested otherwise. "No," he said. "I did not." "A moment. You want to know how many installations there are?" she said. She watched him. "Yes," he said. She said nothing for a moment. Long enough for everyone at both tables to understand the silence was deliberate, that she was not searching for words but choosing whether to use them. "I am not going to tell you," she said. The room was very quiet. Rain moved against the tall windows. The lake outside was gray and flat. In the room, 7 emperors and their staff sat with the specific stillness of people who had prepared for many versions of this conversation and had not prepared for this one. "What I will tell you," Voss said, "is that we did not build them to use them." She looked at Kale specifically, because this was for him, because in the messages over the past 6 months she had read the shape of his thinking and she knew this was the question underneath all the other questions. The consortium has asked, in various ways through various channels, what Terran Authority's strategic intentions are. Whether this is a declaration of hostilities, whether we intend to press any kind of military advantage. She put her hands flat on the table. "The answer is that we built them, so you would have to decide." Pose. "Decide what?" Kale said. "Whether to let us out." She watched him hear it. "For 211 years, she said, the consortium made every decision about our status. Where we could go, what we could build, who we could trade with, what technology we could access. You decided, and we filed protests, and the protests were archived, and you decided again." She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. The even tone was the point. The even tone said this was not anger. This was fact, and facts did not require volume. You took that choice from us the day you drew the Pale. We simply took it back. The room held the silence. Kale was very still. He had the Velhari stillness that could mean displeasure or fear, and she had learned in 6 months of his messages to read the difference. This was neither one. This was the stillness of a man who had already heard this sentence in his own head, and was now hearing it from the person it was true of. And those were different experiences. "The treaty counter-proposal," he said, "is real," she said. "All of it. The terms are fair, and we mean them. You filed a notice," he said, 162 years ago. She did not say the number. He knew the number. In the protest after Kepler, a notice that Terran Authority intended to develop defensive systems. Yes. We archived it. Yes. The word sat there between them. Just yes. One word for 162 years of building in the dark. How many people knew? He asked. On your side, how many people knew about the installations over the full period? Voss thought about her grandfather, about his grandfather before him, about the relay of knowing not a secret. Exactly. Because secrets corrode when they are kept too long, but something different. A knowledge that was passed down like a trade, like the way a family passes down how to do a specific kind of work, generation to generation, not because there is ceremony to it, but because the work is not finished and someone has to continue it. Enough people, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His large, calm face, 340 years of accumulated composure. And underneath it, something that she recognized without being able to name, the way you recognize an emotion in a person from a completely different place because there are some things that translate across any distance. I ordered the Kepler blockade, he said. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He said it the way you say a fact that you have decided to own fully before you continue the conversation, because owning it is the only way the conversation can be anything other than performance. She looked at him. I know, she said. The rain on the windows, the gray lake, the high ceiling of a room built by people who believed enough nations in the same space could produce something other than a war. What do you want? He said. Not diplomatically, directly, in the flat way his messages had been direct, stripping the formal language down to the actual question. It was a big question. It was the question underneath all the other questions. What did 211 years of a cage produce in the people who lived in it and built in it and passed their reasons down through generations? What did 60,000 dead at Kepler become when you gave it 2 centuries and a species that did not stop working? She had thought about this answer for a long time. Membership, she said. Full consortium membership, seat on the Compact Council, removal of the pale, trade access on equal terms. She let a moment go. And a conversation about Kepler that does not use the word times lesson. He was still. She let him be still. Outside, ordinary people moved through the Geneva rain. On the street below the tall window, she could see them, people heading somewhere, carrying things, arguing about small things, living the kind of life that billions of humans lived inside the pale without knowing today was happening, or caring much if they did know. Her daughter-in-law Lena was in a facility on the Mira Ridge right now, running maintenance checks on the array, because the arrays still existed and the arrays were still the point, and the conversation in this room was not separate from the arrays. It was the conversation the arrays had made possible. Kale looked at the Mauritian emperor. Some communication passed between them that she could not read. Then he looked at the other emperors, one by one, briefly, and she watched the compact calculate in real time. They had come here with a position statement, with the intention of opening a conversation about modifications to certain provisions. They had not come here to offer full membership today. In a room in the rain, in a city built by a species that had been filing correct protests into an archive for 2 centuries, but they had also come here not knowing the number. Not knowing the number was the thing. The uncertainty was the thing. The cage was still there, technically, but a cage that contained a number of weapons arrays you could not determine, distributed across a volume of space that you could not fully survey, was a cage that had become a different kind of thing. It was a description of a boundary that one party could cross and the other party could not enforce. And that kind of cage was not a cage anymore. It was a name for a situation. Kale spoke. The compact will require formal sessions, he said. A membership review process. There are procedures. We know the procedures, Voss said. We have read them many times. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. The expression of a man who has been made to understand something and is deciding what to do with the understanding. I expect you have, he said. The formal session continued for another 4 hours. There were legal frameworks to discuss and procedural timelines to establish, and all the other careful machinery of negotiations between parties who have agreed in principle and are now working out what the principle costs in practice. Voss sat through all of it, answering when questions were addressed to her, letting the authorities' legal team handle the language questions, drinking 2 more cups of coffee that were slightly better than the first one. When the session closed and the delegation filed out, Kale was the last to leave the delegation table. He stood for a moment with his large hands at his sides, looking at the room, at the high ceiling, and the old stone and the windows, with rain on them in the way people look at rooms that have become historical. He looked at Voss. "The paragraph," he said. "In the Kepler protest. I read it." She waited. "I read it when it was filed," he said. "I classified it as standard diplomatic language." "I know," she said. "We knew you would." He was quiet. "You built it anyway." "Yes." He looked at the window, the rain, the city outside, ordinary and continuing, uninterested in what had just happened in this room. 162 years, he said. "Yes." He said nothing else. He walked toward the door. Then he stopped. "The installations," he said, not turning. "The ones in the unsurveyed systems. The ones we do not have a number for." She waited. "Are they real?" She looked at the back of his head, at the gray of his formal Velhari rank, at the 340 years of him standing in a room built by a species he had caged, asking her a question whose answer he already understood. "Interesting question," she said. He left. Mako appeared at her shoulder. He was being very careful with his face. "Was that a yes?" he said. Voss picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, set it down. "Walk with me," she said. They walked out of the room together, into the corridor, toward the building's front entrance where the Geneva rain was audible now, closer. She did not answer his question. She did not need to. Mako was young, but he had spent 2 years learning to read what she said and what she did not say, and the 2 years had made him good at it. She thought about her grandfather's supply invoice, framed on the wall of her quarters on the station, the equations on the back. High school physics, available to any species in the universe, who sat down with it long enough. She thought about Lena at the Ridge Array, about the grandchildren she saw on video calls, about 60,000 at Kepler and 11 on the Times, on her doctrine times, and the space between those numbers, where all the work had been done. She pushed open the building's front door. The Geneva rain came down cold and clean and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside. The way rain always is. The way the universe is not hostile, not merciful, just present and consistent, running on the same physics everywhere, offering the same equations to anyone patient enough to sit with them long enough. She stepped out into it, looked up. The sky was the same sky it had always been. It was just that tonight, for the first time in 211 years, the line someone else had drawn across it was gone.